It is especially exciting to be an evolutionary psychologist during this time in the history of science. Most scientists operate within long-established paradigms. Evolutionary psychology, in contrast, is a revolutionary new science, a true synthesis of modern principles of psychology and evolutionary biology. By taking stock of the field at this time, I hope this book contributes in some modest measure to the fulfillment of a scientific revolution that will provide the foundation for psychology in the future. Since the publication of the award-winning first edition of Evolutionary Psychology, The New Science of the Mind, there has been an explosion of new research within the field. New journals in evolutionary psychology have been started, and the volume of evolutionary publications in mainstream psychology journals has steadily increased. New courses in evolutionary psychology are being taught in colleges and universities throughout the world. Many gaps in scientific knowledge remain, and each new discovery brings fresh questions and new domains to explore. The field of evolutionary psychology is vibrant, exciting, and brimming with empirical discoveries and theoretical innovations. Indeed, as Harvard professor Steven Pinker notes, in the study of humans, there are major spheres of human experience: beauty, motherhood, kinship, morality, cooperation, sexuality, violence, in which evolutionary psychology provides the only coherent theory. Pinker, 2002, page 135. Charles Darwin must be considered the first evolutionary psychologist for this prophecy at the end of his classic treatise on the origin of species, 1859. In the distant future, I see open fields for far more important researches. Psychology will be based on a new foundation. More than 150 years later, after some false starts and halting steps, the science of evolutionary psychology is finally emerging. The purpose of this book is to showcase the foundations of this new science and the fascinating discoveries of its practitioners. When I first started to conduct research in evolutionary psychology as an assistant professor at Harvard University in 1981, evolutionary speculations about humans abounded, but practically no empirical research had been conducted to back them up. Part of the problem was that scientists who were interested in evolutionary questions could not bridge the gap between the grand evolutionary theories and the actual scientific study of human behavior. Today that gap has closed considerably because of both conceptual breakthroughs and an avalanche of hard-won empirical achievements. Many exciting questions still cry out for empirical scrutiny, of course, but the existing base of findings is currently so large that the problem I faced was how to keep this book to a reasonable length while still doing justice to the dazzling array of theoretical and empirical insights. Although it is written with undergraduates in mind, it is also designed to appeal to a wider audience of laypersons, graduate students, and professionals who seek an up-to-date overview of evolutionary psychology. I wrote the first edition of this book with another purpose as well, frankly, a revolutionary one. I wrote it so that the hundreds of professors at colleges and universities throughout the world who have been thinking and writing about evolution and human behavior would be motivated to teach formal courses in evolutionary psychology and get those courses established as part of required psychology curricula. Already evolutionary psychology is attracting the best and the brightest young minds. I hope that this book helps to accelerate the trend and in some small way contributes to the fulfillment of Darwin's prophecy. New to this edition. In revising the book for this edition, I had two goals in mind. First, I sought to provide a major update of new discoveries. Toward this end, roughly 200 new references have been added to this edition. Second, I sought to fill in important omissions based on an explosion of new theories and research, expanded coverage of cultural evolution, with a new section on culture-gene coevolution. New studies on evidence for a small amount of interbreeding between modern humans and Neanderthals. New large-scale studies on ovulation effects on women's mate preferences. Expanded discussion of evolutionary hypotheses that have been empirically disconfirmed. Expanded discussion of the emotion of disgust as central to the behavioral immune system and sexual disgust as a specific evolved defense and links to preferred mating strategy. Discovery of a new cue to physical attractiveness, lumbar curvature. New findings on the emotion of sexual regret and gender differences therein from the highly gender egalitarian country of Norway. Mate preferences among the semi-nomadic Himba of Namibia. Discoveries of the effects of marriage on longevity. Discussion of mismatches between ancestral and modern environments. Expanded discussion of theories and empirical tests of homosexuality, bisexuality, and other sexual orientations. Use of modern apps, such as Snapchat, to seek mating opportunities. New discussion of the method of evolutionary computer simulations and agent-based modeling. Effects of physical and behavioral resemblance of child to father on paternal investment. New work on food aversions in pregnant women. Eye tracking studies showing that dangerous predators capture our visual attention, even in the face of visual distractions. Study of 53 cultures reveals an effect of burdensomeness to kin on suicidal ideation and suicide. New section on accidental death. Influence tactics children and parents use on each other. Effects of genetic relatedness, such as full versus half siblings, on kin investment. Evidence from Icelandic Vikings on causes of Viking raids and evidence that kin protect against getting killed in raids. Empirical refutation of a kin-based hypothesis about sexual infidelity. New section on need-based transfers, risk pooling, and social insurance. Use of social media and cyberbullying in intrasexual competition. Eye tracking studies reveal spontaneous assessment of physical formidability in others. Individual difference predictors of the sexual overperception bias. Dark triad personality traits predict sexual deception and sexual harassment. Massive study of 63,000 people reveals strong gender differences in upset over sexual versus emotional infidelity among heterosexuals, but not among those with other sexual orientations. New study of sexual jealousy among women in Mozambique. Women's resistance tactics to male mate guarding. Death before dishonor, the tremendous importance of social reputation. New study of 33 non-industrial populations reveals effects of men's status on a variety of reproductive outcomes. New research on the emotions of pride and shame and status and reputation. New research on the importance of physical formidability in modern status hierarchies. Expanded section on the evolutionary psychology of religion and the role of big gods in large-scale cooperation. I have received many inspiring letters and emails from teachers and students who have used previous editions of Evolutionary Psychology and hope that future readers will also share their enthusiasm. The quest for understanding the human mind is a noble undertaking. As the field of evolutionary psychology matures, we are beginning to gain answers to the mysteries that have probably intrigued humans for hundreds of thousands of years. Where did we come from? What is our connection with other life forms? And what are the mechanisms of mind that define what it means to be a human being? Supplements. Please visit the companion website at www.routledge.com/cw/bus. Acknowledgements. The acknowledgements for this book must include not only colleagues who have directly commented on its contents, but also those who have influenced my personal evolutionary odyssey, which has spanned more than 25 years. My interest in evolution began in an undergraduate geology class in the mid-1970s when I first realized that there were theories designed specifically to explain the origins of things. My first evolutionary groping was a term paper for a course in 1975 in which I speculated, drawing on now laughable primate comparisons, that the main reason men have evolved a status-striving motive is higher status produced increased sexual opportunities. My interest in evolution and human behavior grew when I was in graduate school at the University of California at Berkeley, but I found the most fertile evolutionary soil at Harvard University, which offered me a position as assistant professor of psychology. There I began teaching a course on human motivation using evolutionary principles, although the text scarcely mentioned evolution. My lectures were based on the works of Charles Darwin, W.D. Hamilton, Robert Trivers, and Don Simmons. I started corresponding with Don Simmons, whose 1979 book is considered by many the first modern treatise on human evolutionary psychology. I owe Don special thanks. His friendship and insightful commentary have informed practically everything that I've written on the subject of evolutionary psychology. Influenced by Don's ideas, I designed my first evolutionary research project on human mating, which eventually mushroomed into a cross-cultural study of 10,047 participants from 37 cultures around the world. After word got around about my evolutionary interests, a brilliant young Harvard graduate student named Leda Cosmides rapped on my office door and introduced herself. We had the first of many discussions, actually arguments, about evolution and human behavior. Leda introduced me to her equally brilliant husband and collaborator John Tupy, and together they tried to correct some of the more egregious errors in my thinking, something they continue to do to this day. Through Leda and John, I met Irv Dever, a prominent Harvard anthropologist who conducted simian seminars at his Cambridge home, and Martin Daly and Margot Wilson, who came to Harvard on sabbatical. At that point, the early to mid-1980s, Leda and John had not yet published anything on evolutionary psychology, and no one was called an evolutionary psychologist. The next pivotal event in my evolutionary quest occurred when I was elected to be a fellow at the Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences in Palo Alto. Thanks to the encouragement of Director Gardner Lindsay, I proposed a special center project entitled Foundations of Evolutionary Psychology. The acceptance of this proposal led Leda Cosmides, John Tooby, Martin Daly, Margot Wilson, and me to spend 1989 and 1990 at the center, working on the foundations of evolutionary psychology, even through the earthquake that rocked the Bay Area. In writing this book, I owe the greatest intellectual debt to Leda Cosmides, John Tooby, Don Simmons, Martin Daly, and Margot Wilson, pioneers and founders of the emerging field of evolutionary psychology. Harvard on one coast and the Center for Advanced Study on the other provided a bounty for budding evolutionary scholars, but I must also thank two other institutions and their inhabitants. First, the University of Michigan supported the Evolution and Human Behavior Group between 1986 and 1994. I owe special thanks to Al Kane, Richard Nisbet, Richard Alexander, Robert Axelrod, Barb Smuts, Randolph Ness, Richard Wrangham, Bobby Lowe, Kim Hill, Warren Holmes, Laura Betzig, Paul Turk, Eugene Bernstein, and John Matani for playing key roles at Michigan. Second, I thank the Department of Psychology at the University of Texas at Austin, which had the pre-science to form one of the first graduate programs in evolutionary psychology in the world under the heading of Individual Differences and Evolutionary Psychology. Special thanks go to Joe Horn, Dev Singh, Del Thiessen, Lee Willerman, Peter McNeilage, David Cohen, and the department chairs Randy Deal, Mike Domjan, and Jamie Pennebaker for their roles at Utah. I owe tremendous thanks to friends and colleagues who have contributed to the ideas in this book in one form or another: Dick Alexander, Bob Axelrod, Robin Baker, Jerry Barco, Jay Belsky, Laura Betzig, George Bittner, Don Brown, Eugene Bernstein, Arnold Buss, Bram Buink, Liz Cashton, Nap Chagnon, Jim Chisholm, Helena Cronin, Michael Cunningham, Richard Dawkins, Irv Dever, Franz de Waal, Mike Domjan, Paul Ekman, Steve Emlin, Mark Flynn, Robin Fox, Robert Frank, Steve Gangested, Carl Grammer, W.D. Hamilton, Kim Hill, Warren Holmes, Sarah Erdei, Bill Jankowiak, Doug Jones, Doug Kenrick, Lee Kirkpatrick, Judy Langlois, Bobby Lowe, Kevin McDonald, Neil Malamuth, Janet Mann, Linda Mayuli, Jeffrey Miller, Randolph Ness, Dick Nisbet, Steve Pinker, David Rowe, Paul Rosen, Joanna Sheeb, Paul Sherman, Erwin Silverman, Jeff Simpson, Dev Singh, Barb Smuts, Michael Studd, Frank Sulloway, Del Thiessen, Nancy Thornhill, Randy Thornhill, Lionel Tiger, Bill Took, John Townsend, Robert Trivers, Jerry Wakefield, Lee Willerman, George Williams, D.S. Wilson, E.O. Wilson, and Richard Wrangham. I would like to thank the following reviewers for their feedback on the first edition: Clifford R. Minot, Bowling Green State University; Richard C. Keefe, Scottsdale College; Paul M. Bronstein, University of Michigan Flint; Margot Wilson, McMaster University; W. Jake Jacobs, University of Arizona; and A.J. Figueredo, University of Arizona, as well as the reviewers for the second edition: John A. Johnson, Penn State, Dubois; Kevin McDonald, California State University, Long Beach; and Todd K. Shackelford, Florida Atlantic University. Also, a special thank you to the third edition reviewers: Brad Duchesne, Harvard University, Hyde Island, University of Central Arkansas; Angelina Macune, University of Tennessee at Martin; Roger Melgren, University of Texas at Arlington; Amy R. Pierce, Arkansas State University; and Thomas Sawyer, North Central College. The creation of the second edition benefited from the exceptionally thoughtful comments and suggestions by and discussions with a number of friends and colleagues: Petra Bakaler, Clark Barrett, Leda Cosmides, Martin Daly, Richard Dawkins, Todd Decay, Josh Duntley, Mark Flynn, Barry Friedman, Steve Gangested, Jungwon Jian, Doug Kenrick, Marty Hasselton, Bill Von Hippel, Rob Kurzban, Peter McNeilage, Jeffrey Miller, Steve Pinker, David Rackison, Kern Reeve, Paul Sherman, Valerie Stone, Larry Sugiyama, Candace Taylor, John Tooby, Glenn Weisfeld, and Margot Wilson. Josh Duntley must be singled out for sharing his encyclopedic knowledge and keen insights. I would also like to thank Carolyn Merrill of Allen and Bacon for wise counsel, persistence, and pre-science. I would like to thank the following individuals for help making additions and improvements to the third edition: Leda Cosmides, Josh Duntley, Ernst Fair, Herbert Gintis, Ann Gordon, Ed Hagen, Marty Hasselton, Joe Henrich, Jungwon Jian, Mark Flynn, Barry X. Cool, Rob Kurzban, Dan O'Connell, John Patton, Steve Pinker, David Rackison, Pete Richardson, Andy Thompson, and Wade Rowett. I would like to thank the following individuals for insightful comments and suggestions on the 4th edition: Alice Andrews, Ayla Arslan, Sean Bockelbank, Joseph Carroll, Elizabeth Cashton, Lee Kronk, John Edlund, Bruce Ellis, A.J. Figueredo, Aaron Getz, Joe Henrich, Sarah Hill, Russell Jackson, Peter Carl Jonasson, Jeremy Coaster, Barry Cool, David Lewis, Frank McAndrew, David McCord, Jeffrey Miller, David Rackison, Brad Sagarin, David Schmidt, Todd Shackelford, Candace Taylor, and Gregory Webster. I would also like to thank my wonderful editor, Susan Hartman, who provided support and enthusiasm throughout several editions of this book, and my superb and meticulous production editors, Aparna Yellai and Revathi Viswanathan. The 5th edition benefited from discussions with Alice Andrews, Harold Euler, Lee Kirkpatrick, Christine Legger, Stacy Lynn, Ara Narenzian, David Rackison, and Andy Thompson. Acknowledgements for the 6th edition. Thanks go to my students past and present who have made major contributions to the field of evolutionary psychology: Lathal Shawaf, Kelly Assow, April Blesk, Mike Botwin, Jamie Confer, Sean Conlon, Dan Conroy Beam, Courtney Crosby, Todd Decay, Josh Duntley, Judith Easton, Bruce Ellis, Diana Fleischman, Kari Getz, Aaron Getz, Heidi Grayling, Arlette Greer, Marty Hasselton, Sarah Hill, Russell Jackson, Jungwon Jian, Barry Cool, Liasa Kilheku, David Lewis, Ann McGuire, Karen Perilou, David Schmidt, Anna Sedlicek, Todd Shackelford, and Joy Wickoff. Special thanks also to Kevin Daly, Todd Decay, Josh Duntley, A.J. Figueredo, Barry Cool, Marty Hasselton, Rebecca Sage, Todd Shackelford, and W. Jake Jacobs for generously providing detailed comments on the entire book. This 6th edition benefited especially from the detailed and thoughtful suggestions by Dan Conroy Beam, Mating and Agent-Based Modeling, Patrick Durkee, Status and Dominance, Christine Legger, Cultural Evolution, and half a dozen anonymous reviewers. The greatest debt for this edition is to Athena Actopus, who generously provided extensive comments on many chapters and greatly improved both the intellectual vibrancy and tone of those chapters. Part 1. Foundations of Evolutionary Psychology. 2 chapters introduce the foundations of evolutionary psychology. Chapter 1 traces the scientific movements leading to evolutionary psychology. First, we describe the landmarks in the history of evolutionary theory, starting with theories of evolution developed before Charles Darwin and ending with modern formulations of evolutionary theory, widely accepted in the biological sciences today. Next, we examine 3 common misunderstandings about evolutionary theory. Finally, we trace landmarks in the field of psychology, starting with the influence Darwin had on the psychoanalytic theories of Sigmund Freud and ending with modern formulations of cognitive psychology. Chapter 2 provides the conceptual foundations of modern evolutionary psychology and introduces the scientific tools used to test evolutionary psychological hypotheses. The first section examines theories about the origins of human nature. Then we turn to a definition of the core concept of an evolved psychological mechanism and outline the properties of these mechanisms. The middle portion of Chapter 2 describes the major methods used to test evolutionary psychological hypotheses and the sources of evidence on which these tests are based. Because the remainder of the book is organized around human adaptive problems, the end of Chapter 2 focuses on the tools evolutionary psychologists use to identify adaptive problems, starting with survival and ending with the problems of group living. Chapter 1. The scientific movements leading to evolutionary psychology. Learning objectives. After studying this chapter, the reader will be able to identify the 3 essential ingredients of natural selection. Define particulate inheritance. List 3 common misunderstandings about evolutionary theory. Identify when Neanderthals went extinct. Explain why radical behaviorism went into scientific decline. In the distant future, I see open fields for more important researches. Psychology will be based on a new foundation, that of the necessary acquirement of each mental power and capacity by gradation. Charles Darwin, 1859. As the archaeologist dusted off the dirt and debris from the skeleton, she noticed something strange. The left side of the skull had a large dent, apparently from a ferocious blow, and the ribcage, also on the left side, had the head of a spear lodged in it. Back in the laboratory, scientists determined that the skeleton was that of a Neanderthal man who had died roughly 50,000 years ago, the earliest known homicide victim. His killer, judging from the damage to the skull and rib cage, bore the lethal weapon in his right hand. The fossil record of injuries to bones reveals 2 strikingly common patterns, Germain et al. 2009, Trinkaus and Zimmerman, 1982, Walker, 1995. First, the skeletons of men contain far more fractures and dents than do the skeletons of women. Second, the injuries are located mainly on the left frontal sides of the skulls and skeletons, suggesting mostly right-handed attackers. The bone record alone cannot tell us with certainty that combat among men was a central feature of human ancestral life. Nor can it tell us with certainty that men evolved to be the more physically aggressive sex. But skeletal remains provide clues that yield a fascinating piece of the puzzle of where we came from, the forces that shaped who we are, and the nature of our minds today. The huge human brain, approximately 1,350 cubic centimeters, is the most complex organic structure in the known world. Understanding the human mind-brain mechanisms in evolutionary perspective is the goal of the new scientific discipline called evolutionary psychology. Evolutionary psychology focuses on 4 key questions. 1. Why is the mind designed the way it is? That is, what causal processes created, fashioned, or shaped the human mind into its current form? 2. How is the human mind designed? What are its mechanisms or component parts, and how are they organized? 3. What are the functions of the component parts and their organized structure? That is, what is the mind designed to do? 4. How does input from the current environment interact with the design of the human mind to produce observable behavior? Contemplating the mysteries of the human mind is not new. Ancient Greeks such as Aristotle and Plato wrote manifestos on the subject. More recently, theories of the human mind such as the Freudian theory of psychoanalysis, the Skinnerian theory of reinforcement, and connectionism have vied for the attention of psychologists. Only within the past few decades have we acquired the conceptual tools to synthesize our understanding of the human mind under one unifying theoretical framework, that of evolutionary psychology. This discipline pulls together findings from all disciplines of the mind, including those of brain imaging, learning and memory, attention, emotion and passion, attraction, jealousy and sex, self-esteem, status and self-sacrifice, parenting, persuasion and perception, kinship, warfare and aggression, cooperation, altruism and helping, ethics, morality, religion and medicine, and commitment, culture and consciousness. This book offers an introduction to evolutionary psychology and provides a roadmap to this new science of the mind. This chapter starts by tracing the major landmarks in the history of evolutionary biology that were critical to the emergence of evolutionary psychology. Then we turn to the history of the field of psychology and show the progression of accomplishments that led to the need for integrating evolutionary theory with modern psychology. Landmarks in the history of evolutionary thinking. We begin our examination of the history of evolutionary thinking well before the contributions of Charles Darwin and then consider the various milestones in its development through the end of the 20th century. Evolution before Darwin. Evolution refers to change over time. Change in life forms was postulated by scientists to have occurred long before Darwin published his classic 1859 book On the Origin of Species, see Glass, Temkin, and Strauss, 1959, and Harris, 1992. For historical treatments. Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, 1744-1829, was one of the first scientists to use the word biology, which recognized the study of life as a distinct science. Lamarck believed in 2 major causes of species change. First, a natural tendency for each species to progress toward a higher form, and, second, the inheritance of acquired characteristics. Lamarck proposed that animals must struggle to survive, and this struggle causes their nerves to secrete a fluid that enlarges the organs involved in the struggle. Giraffes evolved long necks, he thought, through their attempts to eat from higher and higher leaves. Recent evidence suggests that long necks may also play a role in mate competition through physical battles. Lamarck believed that the neck changes that came about from these strivings were passed down to succeeding generations of giraffes, hence the phrase the inheritance of acquired characteristics. Another theory of change in life forms was developed by Baron Georges Leopold Créti and Frédéric Dagobert Cuvier, 1769-1832. Cuvier proposed a theory called catastrophism, according to which species are extinguished periodically by sudden catastrophes, such as meteorites, and then replaced by different species. Biologists before Darwin also noticed a bewildering variety of species, some with astonishing structural similarities. Humans, chimpanzees, and orangutans, for example, all have exactly 5 digits on each hand and foot. The wings of birds are similar to the flippers of seals, perhaps suggesting that one was modified from the other, Daly and Wilson, 1983. Comparisons among these species suggested that life was not static, as some scientists and theologians had argued. Further evidence suggesting change over time also came from the fossil record. bones from older geological strata were not the same as bones from more recent geological strata. These bones would not be different, scientists reasoned, unless there had been a change in organic structure over time. Another source of evidence came from comparing the embryological development of different species, Mayer, 1982. Biologists noticed that such development was strikingly similar in species that otherwise seemed very different from one another. An unusual loop-like pattern of arteries close to the bronchial slits characterizes the embryos of mammals, birds, and frogs. This evidence suggested, perhaps, that these species might have come from the same ancestors millions of years ago. All these pieces of evidence, present before 1859, suggested that life was not fixed or unchanging. The biologists who believed that life forms changed over time called themselves evolutionists. Another key observation had been made by evolutionists before Darwin: many species possess characteristics that seem to have a purpose. The porcupine's quills help it fend off predators. The turtle's shell helps to protect its tender organs from the hostile forces of nature. The beaks of many birds are designed to aid in cracking nuts. This apparent functionality, so abundant in nature, required an explanation. Missing from the evolutionists' accounts before Darwin, however, was a theory to explain how change might take place over time and how such seemingly purposeful structures such as the giraffe's long neck and the porcupine's sharp quills could have come about. A causal process to explain these biological phenomena was needed. Charles Darwin provided the theory of just such a process. Darwin's theory of natural selection. Darwin's task was more difficult than it might at first appear. He wanted not only to explain why change takes place over time in life forms, but also to account for the particular ways it proceeds. He wanted to determine how new species emerge, hence the title of his book On the Origin of Species, as well as why others vanish or go extinct. Darwin wanted to explain why the component parts of animals, the long necks of giraffes, the wings of birds, and the trunks of elephants, existed in those particular forms. And he wanted to explain the apparent purposive quality of those forms, or why they seem to function to help organisms accomplish specific tasks. The answers to these puzzles can be traced to a voyage Darwin took after graduating from Cambridge University. He traveled the world as a naturalist on a ship, the Beagle, for a 5-year period, from 1831 to 1836. During this voyage, he collected dozens of samples of birds and other animals from the Galapagos Islands in the Pacific Ocean. On returning from his voyage, he discovered that the Galapagos finches, which he had presumed were all of the same species, actually varied so much that they constituted different species. Indeed, each island in the Galapagos had a distinct species of finch. Darwin determined that these different finches had a common ancestor but had become different from each other because of the local ecological conditions on each island. This geographic variation was pivotal to Darwin's conclusion that species are not immutable but can change over time. What could account for why species change? Darwin struggled with several different theories of the origins of change but rejected all of them because they failed to explain a critical fact: the existence of adaptations. Darwin wanted to account for change, of course, but he also wanted to account for why organisms appeared so well designed for their local environments. Charles Darwin created a scientific revolution in biology with his theory of natural selection. His book On the Origin of Species, 1859, is packed with theoretical arguments and detailed empirical data that he amassed over the 25 years prior to the book's publication. It was evident that these other theories could not account for the innumerable cases in which organisms of every kind are beautifully adapted to their habits of life, for instance, a woodpecker or tree frog to climb trees, or a seed for dispersal by hooks and plumes. I had always been much struck by such adaptations, and until these could be explained, it seemed to me almost useless to endeavor to prove by indirect evidence that species have been modified. Darwin, from his autobiography, cited in Ridley, 1996, page 9. Darwin unearthed a key to the puzzle of adaptations in Thomas Malthus's An Essay on the Principle of Population, published in 1798, which introduced Darwin to the notion that organisms exist in numbers far greater than can survive and reproduce. The result must be a struggle for existence, in which favorable variations tend to be preserved and unfavorable ones tend to die out. When this process is repeated generation after generation, the end result is the formation of new adaptation. More formally, Darwin's answer to all these puzzles of life was the theory of natural selection and its 3 essential ingredients: variation, inheritance, and differential reproductive success. Point 1. First, organisms vary in all sorts of ways, such as in wing length, trunk strength, bone mass, cell structure, fighting ability, defensive ability, and social cunning. Variation is essential for the process of evolution to operate. It provides the raw materials for evolution. Second, only some of these variations are inherited, that is, passed down reliably from parents to their offspring, who then pass them on to their offspring down through the generations. Other variations, such as a wing deformity caused by an environmental accident, are not inherited by offspring. Only those variations that are inherited play a role in the evolutionary process. The third critical ingredient of Darwin's theory is selection. Organisms with some heritable variants leave more offspring because those attributes help with the tasks of survival or reproduction. In an environment in which the primary food source might be nut-bearing trees or bushes, some finches with a particular shape of beak, for example, might be better able to crack nuts and get at their meat than finches with other shapes of beaks. More finches who have beaks better shaped for nut cracking survive than those with beaks poorly shaped for nut cracking. An organism can survive for many years, however, and still not pass on its inherited qualities to future generations. To pass its inherited qualities to future generations, it must reproduce. Thus, differential reproductive success, brought about by the possession of heritable variants that increase or decrease an individual's chances of surviving and reproducing, is the bottom line of evolution by natural selection. Differential reproductive success or failure is defined by reproductive success relative to others. The characteristics of organisms that reproduce more than others, therefore, get passed down to future generations at a relatively greater frequency. Because survival is usually necessary for reproduction, it took on a critical role in Darwin's theory of natural selection. Darwin's theory of sexual selection. Darwin had a wonderful scientific habit of noticing facts that seemed inconsistent with his theories. He observed several that seemed to contradict his theory of natural selection, which he sometimes referred to as the theory of survival selection. First, he noticed weird structures that seemed to have absolutely nothing to do with survival. The brilliant plumage of peacocks was a prime example. How could this strange luminescent structure possibly have evolved? The plumage is obviously metabolic.